immediate threat posed by climate change is on full display in Greenland. Glaciers there are melting at an alarming pace, which could lead to a devastating sea level rises. NASA climate scientists are investigating the crisis. Our RYTYL Apparel joined the scientists on one of their missions. Tell us, first of all, why NASA are investigating this and what you actually found.
Well, they're investigating it because climate change has just accelerated so much over the past couple of years. And the thing that they are telling us, it was their early findings, is they say, look, a lot of people, when they talk about climate change and the ice melt that's induced by climate change, many people think it's warmer air that's essentially melting a giant ice cube. That is the ice shield in the Arctic. But they say that they're finding that warmer ocean temperatures are also having a significant effect, not just because of the warmer temperatures themselves, but also because of ocean currents that are really leading to a lot of attrition on those glaciers. Very interesting to see what those NASA scientists are doing. Here's what we saw. Bullseye.
In the drink. Perfect.
I saw it, yeah. Oh, wow.
I see it.
But the readouts they get are troubling. Warm water along the entire depth of the glacier, more than 2,000 feet below the surface.
And these warm waters now are able to be in direct contact with the ice over its entire face, supercharging the melting.
So RYTYL means Ox Glacier. And this is what Ox Glacier looked like in 1986. This big slate of ice stretched over more than a square mile. This is what it looks like today. About 5 years ago, an Icelandic geologist declared it no longer a glacier, declaring that it no longer had the scientific qualities of a glacier. It had essentially gone extinct. So that meant the area could no longer be called Ox Glacier. It couldn't be RYTYL anymore. Now it's just Uk. Climate change looks different all over the world, but in Iceland, this is how it is showing up. It's their first lost glacier. Glaciers cover about 11% of the country, but as global temperatures keep rising, scientists say that the country's glaciers are going to keep going the way that Uk did over the next few decades, and within 200 years, Iceland will have precisely 0 glaciers.
Iceland may have to change its name because this Viking nation's glaciers are melting. Environmental researcher Siguros Arnardóttir took me to see a deep lagoon with icebergs floating where a glacier had been.
10 years ago, the lagoon didn't even exist.
How does it make you feel to see this lake?
Honestly, it's quite a love-hate thing for me. It just screams climate change.
Iceland has nearly 300 named glaciers. One is already completely gone. This summer, the locals held a funeral for it. Around the world, more than 300 billion tons of glacier ice is melting every year, warming the oceans and lifting them. This stunning video was shot last month in Greenland, where temperatures in the 70s melted so much glacier ice, it created a river. We found the same all across Iceland.
Everywhere we've been going, we've been passing these little streams.
It almost feels like the glacier is bleeding.
There's enough ice in Greenland to raise sea levels by 7.5 meters. So it's an enormous volume of ice. That's about 25 feet. And that would be devastating to coastlines all around the planet.
The things that I found interesting is we were speaking to some local folks there in Greenland, and they were telling us that, they've been witnessing this firsthand, how these glaciers have not only receded, some of them by kilometers, but they've also gotten a lot thinner, a lot lower. So that ice melt can clearly be seen and felt there.
I was surprised what they said. There's 7.5 meters into this. That's huge.
That's a lot, and that's a lot. And I asked them, look, what can we do to slow this down? What can we do about this? And they said it really is cutting emissions is the thing to do, because that's what's driving warming in the entire planet, not just the air, but of course then the oceans as well. But they also said right now, the pace at which things are going, people need to start thinking about moving away from coastal areas in certain places.
Can you just give us a sense of how significant this melting is in Greenland right now?
Well, we haven't seen melting like this in 150 years, except for the year 2012. And it looks like 2019 is actually going to break that record in terms of the amount of melting that's coming off of Greenland. We're seeing a lot of runoff from the sides of the ice sheet, and that, of course, adds to this river flow that goes into the ocean eventually. It's really quite dramatic, and the biggest that we've seen, as I said, in about 7 years. But prior to that, it's been over 150 years since the very top of Greenland has melted. All of these things are faster now than they were just a few decades ago. And the concern is that the rate is going to keep going up and at a faster and faster rate. That'll actually accelerate. A millimeter may not sound like much. Small amounts of sea level rise have a big impact on very low-lying areas, very flat areas. If you talk to Miami, New Orleans, Houston, they're concerned about an inch or two over the coming decades of sea level rise because it means higher storm surges and it means flooding and changes in groundwater right now.
The crane towering over Rockaway Beach is a symbol of New York City's urgent, almost frantic effort to prevent a repeat of what happened in 2012. When Hurricane Sandy nearly brought the city to its knees.
We have 520 miles of shoreline. We've always been at risk of coastal inundation, but Sandy really changed the way we think about that risk and how we engage with the waterfront.
The response is not simply about minimizing hurricane damage. The larger issue, the issue making hurricanes more destructive, is sea level rise caused by climate change and a warming planet.
We're not labeling things with sea level rise when we should be.
Ben Strauss is a scientist with the research organization Climate Central.
A storm comes in, we have a damaging flood, and we say we had a storm, we had a flood. But every flood is deeper, bigger, and more damaging because of the sea level rise we've already had.
In the last century, the sea rose at least 8 inches, and the rate has been accelerating since the 1990s. In the Rockaways, Mayor Bill de Blasio recently and with great fanfare opened the first stretch of a new concrete boardwalk built above the floodplain to replace the wooden one Sandy destroyed.
Even just considering the 2050 scenarios, about 8% of the city's shoreline could be flooded on a daily basis just due to high tide, not even during a coastal storm event. And so thinking through the implications on neighborhoods, the investments we need to make to reduce risk and to handle that level of inundation is something that's driving our policies around our entire coastal protection plan.
Take Charleston, South Carolina, which is known as low country for a reason. This spot just near the center of the city is only several feet above sea level.
Sandy Bridges owns a small boutique nearby in Charleston's vibrant tourist district.
High tide, rainy day, we just always experience flooding here.
Guaranteed.
It comes right up to my doorstep on a really heavy downpour.
This is what it looked like near her store in 2012 after Hurricane Isaac brushed by the city. The fast-growing region is one of the eastern seaboard's most vulnerable. Waterways snake through the city and neighborhoods have been built on landfill. Flooding has plagued the city for generations, but it's getting worse.
At a particularly high tide, floodwater already comes in through the seawall and through the sidewalk, and it fills the street right here at this intersection.
Environmentalist Chris Carnival says sometimes it doesn't even take rain during an unusual high tide to trigger what the locals call nuisance flooding.
We used to see about 4.5 days of nuisance flooding per year in the mid-20th century. Now we're up to about 23 days per year. When we project that into the future, as seas continue to rise, that's going to be many more days per year.
Even so, business owners, scientists, and environmentalists say, unlike New York, officials are moving too slowly in planning and seeking the necessary funds.
We've been highlighting the risks to major cities from sea level rise. Now, we've talked about how water can wipe out our history, its effect on population, the impact on our country's military bases, and the dangers of hazardous materials on metropolitan areas. Now let's talk about rising seas and how it will affect your wallet. We're talking property values and how they're at risk. Now, with every inch the sea rises, some of our cities inch towards disaster. This is how West Palm will look, all right behind me, with a 1-foot rise. It could submerge real estate worth $799 to $1.4 billion. Now, let's take a look at New York City. Here's the sea level rise of 1, 3, 5, and 8 feet. And how that could impact the city. We're talking about the airports underwater, inundating those airports. Hurricane Sandy, of course, in 2012 was a turning point, and the storm highlighted New York City's vulnerabilities to coastal storms and rising seas. Thousands of buildings were damaged. Individual property values across the 5 boroughs dipped nearly 20 $50,000 after Sandy. Now, listen to this. The official value of all the assessed property in New York City tops $1 trillion in 2017. And look at what happens when there's an 8-foot sea level rise. There's a lot of real estate and money that is going to be underwater.
Tonight, Venice and some of its most famous landmarks submerged again as the city struggles with weeks of unprecedented and deadly flooding. The water is up above my knee line, and they're expecting St. Mark's Square to stay flooded like this for the rest of the week. Water inundating this iconic landmark, damaging homes and businesses nearby. The mayor saying it could cost more than $1 billion to repair. Reports of as many as a third of visitors canceling their trips. Locals agree something needs to be done. Hundreds taking to the streets. Many say they are fearful for their city's future.
Venice is literally drowning and the water is rising.
During the worst of the flooding, this man was swimming, suitcases floating like gondolas. Many here are blaming climate change as Venice tries to keep its businesses running. Tonight, we're dealing with another high tide and more flooding here in St. Mark's Square, and we're expecting to see a repeat of this scene again and again over the next few days. Tom, it is getting so bad here that the local government has even started asking for international donations to help.
Between the glistening light posts and massive mounds of snow and ice, the frosty Lake Michigan shoreline in Grand Haven has become a photographer's playground. But there's something else, something unseen happening here.
So Mother Nature bringing in that extra moisture from across the world and dropping it here in the Great Lakes Basin.
Tom O'Brien with the Army Corps of Engineers says water levels in the Great Lakes could reach near record highs at their peak this summer. And the numbers tell the story our cameras can't. Lake Michigan is nearly a foot higher than a year ago and nearly 4 feet higher than 5 years ago.
There's been a few houses that have fallen in down in the New Buffalo area, actually, at the southern end of Lake Michigan last year. And there's some that are very close to having catastrophes again for this upcoming season.
And rising waters impact more than just lakefront homeowners. Higher levels have stolen hundreds of feet of beach in Grand Haven over the past few years and could hurt the pier restoration. But as high as the water is now and as unpredictable as it may seem, seemingly one thing is certain.
It's going to change. Just like the weather changes in West Michigan, the water levels of the Great Lakes will change.
As far as the eye can see, Antarctica is covered by thick sheets of ice. In some places, that ice is several miles deep. This massive continent, as big as the US and Mexico combined, has for millions of years been home to some of the most breathtaking examples of ice on the planet.
What you can see behind me here is a very good cross-section of a glacier in Antarctica. And what you can see with all of those different layers, that is hundreds and thousands of years of snowfall and precipitation stacking up one on top of the other and slowly exerting pressure downward on those layers of snow, and that's basically how a glacier is formed.
But Antarctica's ice is now increasingly being threatened, and most researchers believe it's because of climate change. According to one recent study, the continent's ice is slipping away 6 times faster than it was 40 years ago.
And Antarctica is now losing 252 gigatons of ice per year.
Glaciologist Joe McGregor is part of the team at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center that's studying Antarctica's ice. Using radar and lasers, they measure the thickness of the ice, how it's moving, and whether it's growing or shrinking. This animation they built shows a sped-up version of how the ice flows on the continent.
Help me understand what that means, 250 gigatons.
A gigaton is 1 billion metric tons of ice. And when you do the math, you wind up with the Antarctic ice sheet is out of balance by more than 3.5 swimming pools per second.
Every second, 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of ice is disappearing from Antarctica.
Yes, when considered on average over the year.
Just to put that in perspective, in the amount of time it takes to watch this story, Antarctica will shed more water than New York City uses every day.
It's becoming clearer that parts of Antarctica appear to be unstable and are losing ice much faster than we expected.
Michael Oppenheimer is a climate scientist and professor of geoscience at Princeton University. He says this ice loss will only accelerate sea level rise, which happens for 2 reasons. One, a warming atmosphere warms the oceans, and warmer water expands and rises. Secondly, warming also melts ice and glaciers all over the world, sending new water into the ocean.
So ultimately, if we lose all the ice that's vulnerable to a warming of only a few degrees, we're talking about a very, very, very big sea level rise.
The most recent UN report predicts 1 foot of sea level rise this century if we continue burning oil and gas and coal at our current pace. But a growing number of researchers believe that because of the emissions we've already put up into the atmosphere, that prediction understates the threat. Alexandra Eisern oversees all Antarctic science for the National Science Foundation, who, for the record, is a NewsHour underwriter. She says that in West Antarctica, 2 huge glaciers, Pine Island and Thwaites, are considered at serious risk of collapse.
There's some researchers that study Pine Islands and the Thwaites Glacier that feel that it's become sufficiently destabilized that we won't be able to recover.
Michael Oppenheimer says if just one of those glaciers winds up in the ocean, sea levels will rise 5 times higher than the UN predicted.
The current estimates are if the Thwaites Glacier were to totally disintegrate into the ocean, that ultimately sea level would rise by something like 5 feet. In areas around some of our biggest cities, New York, Boston, Miami, where you've got a lot of development, homes, buildings, infrastructure like roads very close to sea level. How do you defend those? How would Bangladesh protect itself? It's got many hundreds of miles of coastline. It's all right at sea level. You can't build a wall to protect that whole coast. There's actually nothing that can be done.
That's millions of people that are going to have to move.
Right. There are about 150 million people that live in Bangladesh, and probably a few million of them would have to move back. And where are they going to go in such a densely populated country? And there's already strife when people try to move into India. People get killed trying to do that now. What's going to happen when you have a few million people that all of a sudden try to move? It's not a pretty picture.
Many glaciers form what are known as ice shelves, huge platforms of ice, some as wide as Texas and hundreds of stories tall, that grow out over the ocean and help hold their much larger glaciers up on land. They hold it back and not let it slide into the sea.
Imagine a piece of ice the size of Texas, pretty thick, is going to slow the ice as it tries to flow into the ocean.
Robin Bell of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory has been studying Antarctica's ice for over 20 years.
Ice shelves are very important. They're essentially acting as bouncers in the bar, leaning up against the door and keeping the ice from flowing into the ocean.
But as the atmosphere keeps warming, major ice shelves in Antarctica have also been collapsing. In 2002, the Larsen B ice shelf, the size of Rhode Island, completely disintegrated. These are satellite images of it breaking up into hundreds of pieces. As predicted, the glaciers that Larsen B anchored up on land began accelerating towards the ocean. And then, 2 years ago, the even bigger Larsen C shelf, this is it from the air, developed that miles-long crack in it. This shelf, which sits in front of the Thwaites Glacier, is also crumbling. And part of the Brunt ice shelf is expected to break off any day now, releasing an iceberg that'll be twice the size of Manhattan. There's still some debate over whether human-induced warming is the only thing causing these changes. Antarctica has lost ice many times before, and that also caused the seas to rise. Researchers are now trying to determine how much warmth it takes to cause truly catastrophic sea level rise.
Doesn't mean we should all throw up our hands and run. Let's start thinking straight. Let's start thinking fast about how we're going to help people, how we're going to help settlements, how we're going to help countries deal with the outcome. Because a lot of it is not going to be pretty, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be disruptive if we don't get our act together now.
You can talk all you want about models and about future forecasts that things are going to happen a long distance away. Having things happen vividly on TV shows, the news, in the newspapers, all of that helps bring people to the point that things are really changing, and although we thought we might be able to wait a while, in fact, we're probably on the cusp of seeing real changes that would bring these things home to roost, basically, in terms of weather changes. As I said, coastline changes, changes in the amount of drought or heavy rains. All of those things have a major and costly impact. And so people, I think, will begin to decide that long-term commitment to action is what's needed.
Teams from the RAF work to stem the flow of water into the town of Wainfleet. 3 Chinook helicopters dropping bags of gravel to plug the burst banks of the river steeping. But the water has already flooded more than 100 homes here. Residents evacuated after more than 2 months of rain fell in just 2 days.
Nobody's going to believe this. Nobody is going to believe this. We are flooding.
We begin with some severe weather in Texas. Flash flooding that brought more than 20 inches of rain in different parts of the state. And there's more on the way. It's a situation that's making people compare it to Hurricane Harvey. Steve Campion from our affiliate KTRK is in Southeast Texas with the latest. Steve?
The rain has been relentless here in Southeast Texas. You can see it's still falling right now. We are in the small community of Winnie, where the sheriff's office estimates more than 20% of the homes have taken on water. I want you to look at the main drag here in town. You can see it is covered in water. There still are abandoned vehicles here. The drivers were forced to abandon those vehicles due to rising water. And if you look over here, here's one of them here in the ditch. In the distance, another. And a little bit farther over to our right, we have a pickup truck. So this is a serious situation that has unfolded overnight here in Southeast Texas. It's a devastating and dangerous flood. People that we have spoken with have left their homes, and they have come to this gas station to seek refuge. First responders have deployed high water rescue vehicles and boats to help people out here. They are prioritizing those calls based on need, but certainly this is still an unfolding situation happening in Southeast Texas.
For people who might not understand what people mean when they say we have to act in a decade or 12 years or 15 years, help put that into perspective. What does that really mean?
Well, it really means that we need to start changing how we produce energy. And I think trying to get there to a carbon neutral within the space of a decade, probably a bit too much to ask. But the tools are all there for us. The technology is there in terms of solar panels and wind farms, in terms of conservation, electric cars. We can explore things like biofuels. We need to consider nuclear, perhaps, in terms of a power source. It's all in the mix. We know how to do it. And what's more is people are going to make money bringing us this future of energy generation. It's actually, I think, going to be quite easy as soon as we say, as a nation, collectively, individually, city by city, state by state, that we're going to commit to doing these things. And I'm really pleased to see how many states and cities have set a goal for themselves in the future. I'm actually really confident that, in fact, the U.S. is going to lead the way on all of this because we have such a strong entrepreneurial spirit about solving problems once we're convinced they're a problem. And that's what I think the future holds for us.
All right, Ted Scambos, University of Colorado Boulder, thank you very much.
Thank you.